My own mother pointed a finger at me in open court and, with a chilling certainty, declared I was mentally incompetent. I just sat there, quiet, unmoving. She had no idea that her one public act of betrayal was about to trigger the most meticulously planned downfall of her life. She didn't even hesitate. My mother, standing center stage in that St. Clair County probate court, pointed a finger directly at me, and her voice, usually so careful, boomed with a twisted conviction. She is mentally incompetent. She always has been. The word, incompetent, hung in the air, a devastating pronouncement, long before Judge Whiteham had even a chance to speak. I was at the respondent's table, my hands clasped, back ramrod straight. My gaze was locked on a tiny, dark scratch in the old wooden table. I wouldn't look at her. I couldn't look at anyone. I had learned a brutal lesson years ago. Reaction is surrender. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. A pen clattered to the floor, a tiny explosion in the sudden quiet. But my mother, she just kept going. She's unstable, emotional. She should never be allowed to manage money, let alone inherit an estate. And still I said nothing, not out of weakness, not because there was a shred of truth to her words, but because my silence, my absolute refusal to engage, was the one weapon she hadn't anticipated. Judge Ella Whiteham, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back severely, glasses perched low, watched my mother with an expression utterly unreadable. She let her speak, and speak, without interruption. That alone was a chilling sign. This wasn't going to be a quick hearing. My name is Evelyn Cross. I was 34 years old, and according to the woman who literally gave me life, I was no longer fit to control it. The official reason for our gathering? My grandmother's estate. But everyone in that room, every single soul, knew this had nothing to do with money. This was about control, humiliation. It was about rewriting my history in the most public, painful way imaginable. My beloved grandmother, Ruth Cross, had passed just 8 months prior. She died peacefully in her sleep in her little River End house, my hand in hers. She was more than a grandmother. She raised me after my parents' marriage imploded. She packed my lunches, helped with homework, taught me how to balance a checkbook when I was too young to even drive. She left me everything she had. And 3 weeks after her funeral, my mother contested the will. 6 weeks later, that petition claiming I was mentally incompetent landed on my desk, demanding a conservator be appointed immediately, herself. That single legal document didn't just freeze the estate. It quietly, devastatingly froze my entire life. My firm put me on administrative leave. Clients suddenly stopped returning my calls. Colleagues developed an uncanny ability to be busy when I walked by. No one accused me out loud, but no one defended me either. Doubt doesn't need proof. It just needs space to fester. Now, my mother stood there, calm, composed, painting a picture of me as a lifelong burden. She spoke of concern, fear, responsibility, a woman just trying to save her daughter from herself. Anyone who didn't know our twisted history might have actually believed her performance. She finished, smoothing her blazer, a satisfied little smirk playing on her lips, as her attorney, Arthur Nolan, gave a small, confident nod. Finally, Judge Whiteham spoke. "Miss Cross," she said, her eyes now on me, "do you wish to respond to the allegations?" The air in the room thickened, almost suffocating. I simply shook my head once. "No, Your Honor." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. Judge Whiteham studied me for a beat too long, then turned to Mr. Nolan. "Counselor," she said, her voice even, almost serene. "Before we proceed, may I ask you a question?" Arthur Nolan, still smug, straightened. "Of course, Your Honor." She leaned forward, just slightly, and the courtroom's energy shifted. "Do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" He blinked. "She's an accountant. She works locally." The judge didn't respond immediately. Her gaze flickered back to me, then to my mother, then once more to her attorney. Something in her expression deepened. Not anger, not even sympathy, recognition. And in that precise moment, I understood something my mother couldn't possibly grasp. She thought this hearing was about taking something from me. She had absolutely no idea it was about to reveal the ugly truth of who she really was. Because while she had been weaving her elaborate fictions, I had been diligently keeping records. And this courtroom, this very moment, was just the beginning. My mother, she was cunning. Her accusations weren't random. She knew precisely where to inflict the most damage. When she labeled me mentally unstable in court, she wasn't fabricating a lie from scratch. Oh no, she was reaching back, deep into my past, to something profoundly real, fragile, and agonizingly personal. Something she knew, with absolute certainty, I would rather die than have dragged into the brutal light of a courtroom. Because yes, once a long, long time ago, I was broken. I was just 14 when my parents' marriage imploded. It wasn't a quiet, civilized parting. It was an explosion. Shouting matches echoed through the walls. Doors slammed hard enough to shake the entire house. Then, one morning, my father packed a suitcase and simply vanished, leaving the state. 2 months later, my mother remarried. 3 months after that, she simply stopped calling me her daughter. She never fought for custody, never asked how I was, never showed up for school events, birthdays, holidays. I became an inconvenience, a ghost from a past she'd already moved on from. So I went to live with my grandmother, Ruth, in Riverend. From the outside, it looked like a rescue, and in so many ways it was. But inside me, something had already shattered. I stopped sleeping. Eating became a chore. I cried silently, in places where no one could find me. A kind school counselor noticed. She suggested a few sessions to help me adjust. I talked. I cried. I learned words like abandonment and low self-worth before I was old enough to even vote. And slowly, painfully, I began to heal. What my mother did next, I didn't truly grasp until decades later. As my legal guardian at the time, her name remained on all my records. Intake forms, counseling notes, administrative paperwork. She never asked for copies back then. She didn't need them. She just kept them, like ammunition. When she filed her petition all those years later, those dusty old documents resurfaced. Stripped of context, stripped of time, stripped of the healing I'd fought so hard for. A scared teenager's temporary pain was twisted into a lifelong pattern. Childhood vulnerability became chronic instability. She knew no one would read closely. She knew no one would ask what happened after. Because allegations, she understood, are always louder than explanations. By the time the court papers finally reached me, my life was already quietly, painfully unraveling. One afternoon, my firm called me into a conference room. No shouting, no accusations, just careful, corporate language, liability, reputation, optics. They believed me, they said. But belief wasn't the issue. Risk was. I wasn't fired, not exactly. I was sidelined. No new cases, no expert testimony, no work that truly mattered. 7 years of painstakingly built credibility gone, erased with a single malicious filing. At home, the damage seeped into everything. My boyfriend, Daniel Brooks, he tried. He really did. He came from a family where problems were solved over dinner, where parents didn't weaponize the past. At first, he'd promise me, "It'll be okay, Ev. Truth always comes out." But then his parents started asking questions. Then our friends started asking those careful, awkward questions. Until one night, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, Daniel said something that cracked everything wide open. "Why don't you just take a psychological evaluation?" he asked gently. "Just to prove them wrong." I stared at him. It wasn't that I didn't understand his logic. It was that I understood the horrifying implication. If I agreed, I validated the accusation. If I refused, I looked guilty. My mother had trapped me perfectly. That night, Daniel left after our very first, truly ugly argument. I sat alone in my apartment, staring at a framed photo of my grandmother at my college graduation. She was 73, beaming, like I'd just conquered the world. She used to say, "People lie, numbers don't." I clung to that thought, a lifeline, as everything else felt like it was slipping away. What my mother didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she was busily crafting her venomous narrative, I was quietly, instinctively observing patterns. She knew my emotional weak spots. She knew my history, but she didn't know my training. She didn't know I'd spent years tracking fraud, following convoluted paper trails, watching liars crumble under the weight of their own inconsistencies. She thought she was dragging me back into a broken past. What she was actually doing was pushing me, headfirst, into my absolute element. Because once you truly understand how someone is trying to hurt you, you inevitably start asking why. And when I finally asked that question, a chilling realization hit me. This wasn't about my grandmother's wishes. It wasn't even truly about me. It was about desperation. And desperation, I knew, always leaves a trail. The first thing I did, I stopped trying to explain myself. Explanations are emotional. Numbers are not. 2 years before she died, my grandmother had added my name to her primary bank account. For convenience, she'd said, "So, you can help with bills if my arthritis gets worse, if driving becomes difficult." At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now, that tiny detail was the only reason I could see what others couldn't. Late one night, long after Daniel had stormed out and my apartment had settled into an aching quiet, I logged into the account. I told myself I was just checking balances, searching for reassurance. Instead, I found questions. Initially, everything seemed normal. Utility payments, property taxes, groceries, pharmacy charges. My grandmother had been meticulously predictable. Same bills, same times, every month. Then, I widened the date range. I pulled 2 years of statements, dumped them into a spreadsheet, sorted deposits, sorted withdrawals, color-coded categories. It was muscle memory, something I'd done hundreds of times before for other people. And then there it was, the pattern. 7 cash withdrawals. Not checks, not transfers. Cash. They didn't align with any regular expense. No utilities, no medical bills, no home repairs. Just large, round numbers. $4,000, $6,000, $12,000, taken out at irregular, unsettling intervals. I highlighted them all, leaned back in my chair. Total, $48,200. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to slow down. 1 anomaly is a coincidence. 2 is a curiosity. 7 is intent. Next, my grandmother's calendar. She wrote everything down. Doctor appointments, church meetings, even casual visits. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with her meticulously kept notes. Every single one. Every single withdrawal occurred within 3 days of a visit from my mother. I stared at that screen until my eyes burned. This was the moment most people would panic, or cry, or call someone in the middle of the night just to hear a voice. I made coffee, because panic clouds judgment, and judgment was the one thing I absolutely could not afford to lose. I still didn't know how the money had been taken, only that it had, and that meant there was more. People who steal once rarely stop. The next morning, I drove to Riverend. My grandmother's house still carried her scent, lavender cleaner, and old paper. I moved slowly through each room, opening drawers, cabinets, folders. Not rifling, not rushing, just observing. At first, I thought her meticulous record-keeping had simply deteriorated towards the end. Receipts missing, envelopes unlabeled, papers out of order. But then a colder, more unsettling thought took root. What if the disorder wasn't accidental? I checked all the obvious spots, the filing cabinet, desk drawers, the small lockbox in her closet. Nothing definitive. And then it hit me. The safe deposit box. Harbor State Bank, downtown Riverend. She'd added my name to it years ago after a minor break-in scare. I'd helped her store some jewelry and important documents. Then life just happened. I'd completely forgotten. The bank manager recognized her name instantly. He was kind, professional, didn't ask a single question. The box itself was heavier than I expected. Inside were the things I remembered: jewelry, documents, savings bonds. And one thing I didn't: a small, brown leather journal. The first entry was dated 14 months before her death. I found a small bench in the vault room, sat down, and opened it. The handwriting was steady at first, familiar, comforting. She wrote about my mother calling unexpectedly, about apologies, about wanting to reconnect. She wrote that she didn't fully trust it, but she was tired. And hope, she noted, can be terribly persuasive. As the entries continued, the tone subtly shifted. Amounts appeared. Dates. Short, precise notes. Gave her money today. She said it was urgent. She asked me to sign papers. I was confused. My hands started to tremble. This wasn't rambling. This wasn't confusion. This was documentation. My grandmother knew something was terribly wrong. And instead of confronting it, perhaps out of shame or fear, she did the one thing she had always done when something didn't make sense. She wrote it down. By the time I reached the final pages, I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was collecting proof. I closed the journal carefully, sat there for a long moment, breathing in the cool, stale air of the vault. Somewhere, muffled in the distance, I could hear the bank continuing its routine, like nothing had changed. I realized then that this story, the real story, was bigger than me. By the way, if you've stayed with me this far, paying attention to these quiet, insidious details instead of just waiting for the explosions, then you probably understand why this story matters so much. If you like uncovering the truth, hit that subscribe button. There are more unbelievable stories coming your way. I left the bank with that journal tucked under my arm, a terrifying certainty settling deep in my chest. My mother hadn't just lied about me. She had been systematically stealing from her own mother. And now, whether she knew it or not, she had invited the absolute worst person in the world to look closely. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because fear had finally been replaced by something far sharper. Focus. The kind that tightens behind your eyes and absolutely refuses to let go. The journal told me what had happened. It didn't yet tell me how. By morning, I was back at my grandmother's dining table, a war room of papers spread out in careful rows. Bank statements, calendar notes, photos I'd taken of the journal pages. I worked the way I always did, methodically, without assumptions. And that's when I noticed a crucial gap. I could now explain the sporadic, large cash withdrawals. But there was a period where the account activity suddenly became too smooth. Payments bundled, transfers clean, almost professional. Someone else had taken control. I drove back to Harbor State Bank before lunch and requested copies of every authorization document tied to my grandmother's accounts. It took longer than usual. Extra approvals. A quiet conversation behind a glass office. When the folder finally landed in front of me, a cold certainty settled in my gut. There it was, a power of attorney, dated 9 months before my grandmother's death, granting full financial authority to Marjorie Hale, my mother. At first glance, it looked legitimate. Correct formatting, proper language, even a familiar-looking signature. But I don't look at signatures first. I look at notarization. The stamp belonged to a notary named Calvin Moore. I knew that name, not personally, but professionally. I'd seen it before, years ago, in a case involving improperly filed documents. Calvin Moore had retired quietly. His notary commission had expired more than 3 years earlier. I rechecked the date on the document. The power of attorney had been notarized after his retirement. I exhaled slowly. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't a technicality. This was a felony. The signature itself might have been real, perhaps signed on a bad day, under pressure, by a woman who desperately trusted the wrong person. But the notarization? That was fabricated. Someone had taken an old stamp and used it to give a legal authority real, legal teeth. I scanned the document, forwarded it to my attorney, Helen Ward, with a single, blunt line. This shouldn't exist. She called me within 5 minutes. "Where did you get this, Evelyn?" she demanded. "At the bank," I replied. "It's already on file. It's been used." There was a pause. Then, "Evelyn, this changes everything." She was absolutely right. Up until that moment, my mother's case, while cruel, was still civil. Lies, manipulation, character assassination. This document, it turned everything criminal. Helen told me not to confront anyone. Not my mother, not her attorney, not even the bank. "We need to let them believe their story is still intact," she said. "People who think they're winning make mistakes." So I waited. And while I waited, I dug deeper. I pulled every record tied to that power of attorney. Transactions authorized under it, changes in account access, patterns in timing. The name Leonard Hale, my stepfather, kept appearing, not as a signer, not as an owner, but as a destination. Funds moved, accounts linked, short-term transfers that vanished quickly. It wasn't just my mother. It never is. That evening, Daniel cautiously returned. He was unsure if he was even welcome. I showed him the document, the dates, the stamp, the glaring mismatch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it. He just sat there reading. When he finally looked up, his voice was different, softer. "They thought you wouldn't notice," he said. "Yes," I replied. "And they thought no one would believe me if I did." The next day, Helen filed our response to the court. It was deliberately, excruciatingly boring. We denied their allegations. We affirmed my competency. We requested a hearing. No exhibits. No counterclaims. No fireworks. I wanted them to feel relaxed, to get complacent. 2 weeks later, my deposition was scheduled. Arthur Nolan asked the predictable questions: education, employment, mental health history. I answered carefully, minimally, truthfully, but utterly devoid of context. I watched my mother on the video screen in the corner. Her posture softened. A faint, self-satisfied smile played on her lips. She thought I was folding. She had no idea I was documenting. Because while they were so focused on proving I was unstable, they weren't watching their own steps. And every forged stamp, every rushed withdrawal, every careless assumption was quietly aligning, forming something far more dangerous than just a lost inheritance. It was becoming a pattern. And patterns don't just tell stories, they convict. Up until that point, I had treated my mother as the absolute center of everything. Her voice, her accusations, her sudden, ravenous interest in money she hadn't cared about for decades. But once I spread all the documents out before me, the bank records, the authorizations, the transfer logs, I started to see what I'd missed. My mother was loud. The real work had been quiet. Leonard Hale's name kept appearing, again and again, never where it should have been obvious. Not on court filings, not on the power of attorney, not as a direct beneficiary. Always adjacent. A linked account here, a short-term transfer there, funds passing through, disappearing before anyone looking casually would even notice. Leonard was my stepfather, the man my mother married 3 months after my parents' divorce. The man who never raised me, never called me, never once pretended to care. But he was always there, just outside the frame. I started with public records. Leonard owned 3 small commercial properties in St. Clair City, or at least he used to. Over the past 4 years, 2 had been refinanced. 1 quietly sold. Liens appeared, then vanished. Creditors rotated like a macabre carousel. It wasn't collapse. It was struggle. People don't suddenly start stealing from family unless they're truly running out of time. I pulled his business filings next. His companies shifted names subtly over the years. New LLCs, same addresses, same phone numbers, same accountant. Old tricks. The deeper I went, the chillingly clearer it became. Leonard didn't plan. He reacted. And when pressure mounted, he preyed on vulnerable people with access to money. Like an elderly woman desperate to believe her daughter had finally changed. But suspicion wasn't enough. I needed confirmation. That confirmation arrived in the form of an unexpected message request. Phoebe Hale, Leonard's daughter from his first marriage. She had submitted a signed statement supporting my mother's petition, claiming I'd always seemed unstable and irresponsible. According to the court file, that statement carried weight. Now, she wanted to meet. My attorney advised against it immediately. It could be a trap, Helen warned. Anything you say could be twisted. She was right. But I remembered something from the deposition. When Leonard's name came up, Phoebe had looked away from the camera. Not casually. Not politely. Instinctively. I agreed to meet her on neutral ground, a cafe off the highway between Riverend and the city. Public. Ordinary. Safe. Phoebe arrived early. She looked thinner than her photo. Tired. Her hands were never still, stirring coffee she didn't drink, folding napkins, tapping the edge of the table. She didn't start with apologies. She started with honesty. My dad wrote that statement, she said quietly. He told me to sign it. I hesitated. He said it was just paperwork. He said you'd never even see it. I asked her why she agreed. She paused, then looked down at her wrist, touching it lightly, as if checking something invisible. He said I owed him. That was all she needed to say. Phoebe then told me about Leonard's mother, Elaine Hale. She'd lived in assisted care out of state, suffering from genuine dementia. Leonard had her power of attorney. By the time Elaine died, her estate was virtually empty. Leonard claimed care costs had devoured everything. Years later, Phoebe started asking questions. The numbers simply didn't add up. When she confronted him, the conversation ended badly. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Patterns I knew don't repeat by accident. I told Phoebe the truth. I couldn't protect her. But I could tell the prosecutor she cooperated if she was willing to testify honestly. She agreed. Not for revenge, she said, but because she was simply tired of carrying it all. When I drove home that night, the entire, sickening story finally snapped into focus. My mother wasn't the architect. She was the unwitting instrument. Leonard had seen an opportunity. An aging woman with mild cognitive decline. A daughter desperate to reconnect. Another daughter, me, isolated and easy to discredit. And he'd played them all. Back in my apartment, Daniel was waiting. I told him everything. When I finished, he didn't ask what would happen next. He just asked, "How long have you known how to do this?" "All my life," I said. Because my grandmother hadn't just taught me how to balance a checkbook. She taught me how to see what people tried to hide. And Leonard Hale? He had left fingerprints everywhere. He just hadn't realized someone was finally looking. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Arthur Nolan, clever as he was, chose the time deliberately. Early enough to feel intimidating, late enough to ensure I had plenty of time to fret. He framed it as routine, just a chance to clarify a few things before the main hearing. Perfect. Routine was where people dropped their guard. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed plainly. No power blazer. No statement jewelry. Nothing that screamed confidence or authority. I wanted to look exactly as my mother expected. Small, tired, unsure. She appeared on the video screen a few minutes later, sitting beside Leonard. No smile from her. She didn't need one. She thought she was already winning. Arthur Nolan began with easy questions. My name, my age, my education. "I have a bachelor's degree in accounting," I stated. "Where did you study?" "In state." He nodded, scribbled something down, and moved on. He never asked what I did with that degree. Never asked how long I'd been practicing. Never asked why I'd been called as an expert witness in countless other cases. That omission I knew would matter later. When he finally delved into my mental health history, I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said calmly. "I saw a counselor briefly as a teenager." "Why was that?" "My parents divorced." "How did you respond to that divorce?" I struggled temporarily. I didn't elaborate, didn't contextualize, didn't defend myself. I answered like someone with nothing left to say. From the corner of the screen, I watched my mother's posture visibly relax. Leonard leaned back in his chair. Phoebe, sitting further away, kept her eyes fixed on the table. Arthur pushed again. "Have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness?" "No." "Ever been hospitalized?" "No." "Ever been declared unfit to manage your own affairs?" "No." Each answer was clean, boring, utterly unemotional. I could feel the room's collective interest in me waning. That was the goal. People, I've learned, always underestimate what doesn't demand attention. 2 hours later, Arthur concluded with a polite, almost patronizing smile. He thanked me for my cooperation. He said, "We'll see what the judge thinks." When the call ended, I exhaled for the first time all morning. Helen looked at me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "They think you're folding," she observed. "I know," I replied. "That's exactly why they'll walk straight into it." Over the next 2 weeks, we did nothing that looked remotely aggressive. No urgent motions. No accusations. No dramatic revelations. We let the silence do its work. Meanwhile, Helen quietly forwarded the forged notarization to the district attorney. She didn't push. She didn't dramatize. She simply asked them to look. And they did. I didn't know how fast they were moving. I didn't need to. I trusted the process, the same way my grandmother trusted her ledgers, slowly, patiently, with irrefutable proof. The night before the hearing, Daniel asked if I was nervous. I thought about it. "I'm not nervous," I told him. "I'm ready." There's a profound difference. Nerves bloom from uncertainty. Readiness stems from preparation. That night, I drove to Riverend one last time. I didn't go inside the house. I just sat in my car, parked across the street, remembering my grandmother, Ruth, on her porch every Sunday morning, a cup of coffee steaming beside her, meticulously balancing her checkbook by hand. She never rushed. She always double-checked. I understood then that she hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a method. The next morning, the courtroom filled quickly. Not with idle spectators, but with a palpable tension. People sense when something is about to crack, even if they don't know why. My mother arrived late, radiating a misplaced confidence. Leonard followed, composed, his face a mask. Arthur Nolan shuffled papers with the air of a man who already knew the ending. I sat quietly beside Helen. If you've ever wondered why some stories unfold slowly, why every small detail eventually matters, why silence can be infinitely louder than accusations, it's because moments like this don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves. And if you've been listening closely, noticing the subtle shifts instead of just waiting for fireworks, then you already know what's coming. Because the judge hadn't asked her question yet. And once she did, there would be absolutely no way back. Courtrooms have their own unique rhythm. Most people don't notice it. They're caught up in the arguments, the raised voices, the dramatic outbursts. But if you spend enough time in them, you learn that the real turning points are always quiet. They arrive in the pregnant pause between sentences, in the way a judge suddenly stops taking notes, in a question asked just a little too calmly. The hearing began exactly as Arthur Nolan had planned. He stood, buttoned his jacket with a flourish, and launched into a polished narrative about a concerned mother trying to protect a vulnerable estate. He spoke of distance, regret, a daughter who had struggled emotionally for most of her life. My mother nodded at all the right moments. Leonard kept his hands folded, eyes lowered, a picture of practiced restraint. Arthur never once glanced at me. He didn't need to. In his version of the story, I was already an object, not a person. When he finished, the room felt strangely light, as if everyone believed the hardest part was now over. Judge Eleanor Whiteham sat silently for several seconds. She flipped a page in her file, adjusted her glasses, then looked up, her eyes fixed on Arthur. "Counselor," she said, "before we go any further, I need to ask you something." Arthur straightened, oozing confidence. "Yes, Your Honor." She leaned forward, just slightly, not aggressively, not theatrically, just enough to subtly shift the entire atmosphere of the room. "Do you truly have no idea who this woman is?" Arthur blinked. "I'm not sure I understand, Your Honor," he said carefully. Judge Whiteham's gaze flickered to me for half a second, long enough for recognition to register in her eyes, then back to him. "The woman your client is asking me to declare mentally incompetent," she continued, her voice still perfectly calm. "Do you know anything about her professional background?" Arthur glanced frantically at his notes. "She's an accountant," he stammered. "She works locally." The judge didn't respond right away. That silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Enough time for a profound discomfort to creep into the room. She turned to Helen. "Ms. Ward," she said, "would you like to clarify?" Helen stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't dramatize a single word. "Your Honor," she stated, clear and precise. "My client is a senior forensic financial investigator. She specializes in elder financial exploitation. She has testified as an expert witness in dozens of cases, many of them in this very courthouse." Arthur's head snapped up. Leonard's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. My mother froze, a tableau of dawning horror. Judge Whiteham nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd known all along. "Thank you," she said. "That aligns with my recollection." Arthur opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. The judge turned back to him. "Counselor," she said, "given this information, I'm curious why none of it appears in your filings." Arthur swallowed hard. "It didn't seem relevant to the petition, Your Honor." "On the contrary," the judge replied, her voice still calm, but now with an edge of steel. "It seems extremely relevant." She gestured towards Helen. "Miss Ward, you may proceed." Helen didn't rush. She walked to the evidence table and placed a single, unassuming folder in front of the clerk. Copies were distributed. To the judge, to Arthur, to my mother. Helen began with the bank records, dates, amounts, patterns. She walked the court through each suspicious withdrawal, 7 in total, each occurring within days of my mother's documented visits to Ruth Cross. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She simply let the numbers speak for themselves. Arthur's face shifted as he followed along, leaning closer, flipping pages faster. Helen moved on to the power of attorney. She highlighted the notarization, the name, the date. Then she submitted irrefutable proof of the notary's retirement. The room went absolutely still. Leonard stared straight ahead, a statue. My mother shook her head once, sharply, as if sheer denial could somehow erase ink and paper. But Helen wasn't finished. She introduced the journal. Excerpts were read aloud, carefully, respectfully. My grandmother's own words, preserved exactly as she'd written them. Confusion, shame, fear, documentation. I watched my mother's face twist. Not with guilt, but with a blazing outrage. Not at what she'd done, but at being exposed. Helen concluded by outlining the broader pattern beyond just this estate. The chilling similarities. The unanswered questions. The referrals already in motion. She sat down. Judge Whiteham removed her glasses, placed them carefully on the bench, and looked directly at Arthur. "Do you have a response?" Arthur stood slowly. His voice was thinner now, reedy. "Your Honor," he managed. "We would request a brief recess to confer with our client." The judge nodded once. "Granted." As Arthur leaned over and whispered urgently to my mother, she finally looked at me. Truly looked at me. For the first time in 19 years. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I just waited. Because the question had already been asked, and it had changed absolutely everything. The recess lasted exactly 12 minutes. I know because I counted every single one. Arthur Nolan leaned over my mother, whispering frantically, his former confidence utterly shattered, his voice sharp with urgency. Leonard, meanwhile, said nothing. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes unfocused, like a man already calculating his losses, deciding which ones he might actually survive. Phoebe sat at the far end of the bench, hands folded in her lap, motionless. When court resumed, Arthur stood. "Your Honor," he stammered, clearing his throat. "After conferring with my client, we would like to withdraw the petition." A ripple of relief, almost a collective sigh, moved through the room. The kind that comes when people think an unpleasant thing has been neatly, quietly wrapped up. Judge Whiteham did not share it. She looked at Arthur for a long, deliberate moment, then shook her head once. "No," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "That will not be happening." Arthur blinked. "Your Honor," given the evidence presented, the judge continued, her voice now cold steel, "this court is not prepared to simply allow this matter to disappear. What began as a probate petition now raises serious concerns of financial exploitation and fraud." My mother opened her mouth to protest. Judge Whiteham raised a single, silencing hand. "Miss Hale, you've spoken enough today." Silence, thick and final, descended. The judge began listing her actions. Her voice was measured, precise. The petition was denied with prejudice. The evidence would be referred directly to the district attorney's office. Copies would be forwarded to federal authorities for further review. Each sentence landed like a door slamming shut. Arthur said nothing. Leonard finally shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that spoke volumes of resignation. My mother sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes wide, not with fear, but with utter disbelief. She had walked in here expecting control. She was leaving with irreversible consequences. Judge Whiteham finished, signed the order, and then looked directly at me. "Miss Cross," she said, "you are free to go." That was it. No dramatic gavel slam. No shouting. No tearful confrontation. Just paper, ink, and a cold, undeniable finality. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different. Lighter. Like pressure finally releasing after months of being held captive. Daniel was waiting in the hallway. When he saw my face, he didn't ask what happened. He knew. Helen stepped aside to make a phone call. I caught only fragments of her words. "Yes, already forwarded. Exactly what we discussed." Arthur walked past us without meeting my eyes. Leonard followed, shoulders stiff, gaze fixed straight ahead. My mother lagged behind them, disoriented, clutching her purse like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Phoebe stopped. She looked at me just once. Then she simply nodded. 3 days later, my phone rang. Miss Cross, the voice said. This is Special Agent Laura Mendes. She wasted no time. She told me they had reviewed the materials, that the patterns extended further back than I'd even realized, that Leonard Hale's financial history raised significant concerns. They move faster when the paperwork is clean, she said. Yours is very clean. Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Within 2, accounts were frozen. Within 3, arrests were made. Federal charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The indictment ran 18 pages long. Leonard was taken into custody first. My mother followed hours later. Their house was searched, documents seized, hard drives collected. Phoebe cooperated fully. She testified. She turned over records. She answered questions she'd been holding inside for years. The trial took place months later. I didn't attend most of it. I didn't need to. I had already done my part. When the verdict came back, I was at my desk. Guilty on every single count. My mother received 5 years. Leonard received more. Restitution was ordered. Assets seized. Properties liquidated. Everything built on stolen money unraveled exactly the way it always does. Quietly, thoroughly, and without mercy. My grandmother's estate was finally settled that summer. I kept the house in Riverend. Some things simply aren't meant to be sold. On Sundays, Daniel and I sometimes sit on the porch with coffee. I bring my laptop. He brings a book. The world moves slowly there, the way my grandmother liked it. My firm reinstated me the week after the hearing. My first case back involved an elderly woman whose nephew had taken nearly $90,000 from her retirement account. We got it all back. People think justice is loud. They think it announces itself with a bang. It doesn't. Justice, true justice, works the way my grandmother taught me to live. Carefully, patiently, one meticulous record at a time. The hardest part, surprisingly, came after everything was finally over. Not the arrests. Not the verdict. Not even the sentencing. It was the quiet. When the noise stopped, when the story ended, when there was no longer anything left to prove, I was finally forced to sit with what remained. And what remained was a truth my mother had never, not once, understood about me, about my grandmother, about silence itself. People automatically assume silence means weakness. They believe the loudest voice belongs to the strongest person in the room. My mother, oh, she absolutely believed that. She thought that if she spoke first, spoke longest, spoke with enough certainty, the entire world would simply arrange itself around her version of events. She had always lived that way. When my father left, she filled the house with noise, arguments, accusations, dramatic declarations. When she remarried, she announced her new life as if sheer volume alone could somehow erase the old one. And when she came for the inheritance, she did the exact same thing. She filled court filings with screaming words. She filled hearings with outrageously false claims. She filled the air with her unshakable, toxic certainty. What she never once noticed was that my grandmother had taught me the exact opposite. Ruth Cross believed in profound restraint. She believed that truth didn't need to be loud if it was precise. That records mattered infinitely more than explanations. That patience would always outlast brute force. She used to sit at the dining table every Sunday morning, coffee cooling beside her, methodically balancing her checkbook. She never rushed. She never assumed. She checked everything twice. When she realized her own daughter had betrayed her, she didn't confront. She didn't argue. She didn't even tell me. She documented. That choice, that quiet act of methodical record-keeping, ultimately saved me. After the trial, I visited the house in Riverend alone for the first time since. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces. The worn arm of the sofa, the tiny chipped corner of the kitchen counter, the bookshelf where she kept her old lesson plans. In the back bedroom, I opened the dresser drawer, where she used to keep envelopes of receipts. They were still there, yellowed with age, meticulously labeled in her neat handwriting. Electric, water, groceries. Decades of quiet, undeniable order. My phone buzzed as I stood there, a message from Helen. Final paperwork filed. Everything complete. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally let myself feel it. Not triumph, not even relief, but something far steadier, balance. The world had, unequivocally, tipped back in the right direction. A few weeks later, my firm held a small meeting. No grand speeches. No elaborate apologies trying to explain away the doubt. Just a reinstatement notice. And a quiet acknowledgement that they'd been wrong to sideline me without evidence. My first case back immediately reminded me why I do this work in the first place. An elderly woman, a trusted relative, missing money, familiar lies. We followed the same process. Records, timelines, proof. It worked. It always does. Daniel, and I didn't talk much about my mother after that. There wasn't anything left to say. Some people don't need closure. They need distance. We found our peace in routines. Grocery shopping on Sundays. Long walks after dinner. Quiet evenings that felt utterly earned. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the correctional facility where my mother was being held. I didn't open it. I handed it to Helen. She read it, then summarized it in one single, dismissive sentence. Excuses and self-pity. That was enough. Some paper trails simply aren't worth following. I kept my grandmother's journal. Not as evidence anymore. I keep it because it's her voice. Because it reminds me that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like meticulous preparation. Sometimes it looks like patient waiting. My mother thought I was weak because I didn't fight her immediately. She thought I was broken because I didn't shout back. She thought I would collapse under pressure because that's what she would have done. What she never, ever understood was that I wasn't raised by her. I was raised by a woman who understood the profound power of quiet certainty. A woman who believed that if you kept your records, checked your facts, and trusted time to do its work, the truth would, inevitably, surface on its own. And it did. Not with drama, not with vengeance, but with crystal clarity. The last thing my grandmother left me wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the journal that had, in so many ways, saved me. It was perspective. Months after the sentencing, life settled into something steady. Not perfect. Not dramatic. Just honest. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. One evening in early October, Daniel asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. Nothing special, he said. Just somewhere familiar. We ended up at a small chain restaurant just outside the city. The kind of place people underestimate. Cheap wine, endless breadsticks, soft lighting that hides flaws instead of highlighting them. It was where we'd had our very first date, years earlier. Halfway through the meal, Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't make a grand speech. He didn't even get down on one knee right away. He just looked at me and said, "I think we've already proven we can survive the worst parts. I'd like to do the rest of it with you." When he opened the small box, I felt something warm and certain settle in my chest. Not surprise. Recognition. My grandmother would have adored him. She always said I needed someone steady. Someone who didn't mistake chaos for passion. Someone who wouldn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. I said yes. We didn't post it online. We didn't announce it loudly. We told people slowly, one conversation at a time, the way truly good things deserve to be shared. A few weeks later, I spent another weekend in Riverend, finally cleaning out the last of the boxes in the attic. Old lesson plans, faded photographs, holiday decorations wrapped in newspaper from decades ago. At the very bottom of one box, I found a small, unmarked envelope. Inside, a single index card. My grandmother's familiar handwriting. It read, "If you're reading this, it means you trusted yourself." I sat on the attic floor and laughed through tears. Because she was so right. Trusting myself had been the hardest part of it all. Not the investigation. Not the courtroom. Not even standing silently while my own mother tried to erase me. It was trusting that I didn't need to rush. That I didn't need to explain everything to everyone. That truth didn't require a performance. The house in Riverend is still mine. We go there some weekends when the world feels too loud. Daniel reads on the porch. I work at the dining table where my grandmother used to sit. Coffee beside me, spreadsheets open. Not because I have to, but because it feels like home. My work continues. There are always new cases, new families, new versions of the same old story. Someone vulnerable, someone trusted, someone who thinks no one is paying attention. They're wrong. Every single time. People sometimes ask me how I stayed so calm through everything. How I didn't lose myself in anger. How I didn't crumble when the accusations came from my own mother. I tell them the truth. I didn't stay calm because I was inherently strong. I stayed calm because I was prepared. Because I was raised by a woman who believed in receipts, in timelines, in writing things down even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. My mother thought silence meant weakness. She thought patience meant surrender. She thought volume could replace truth. She was wrong. Silence can be a devastating strategy. Patience can be an unstoppable power. And truth, real truth, doesn't need defending. It just needs the space to be seen. If you followed the story from the very beginning, staying with the quiet moments instead of only waiting for the loud ones, then you already understand that some stories aren't meant to shock. They're meant to remind you that careful people still win. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can inherit isn't money at all. It's knowing exactly who you are, even when someone else tries to tell the world you're not. Have you ever had to fight for your truth, quietly and methodically, when everyone else expected you to scream? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to hear them.